There are people who rescue animals and move on, and then there are people who rescue one and never quite recover from it. This is the story of a woman who said just a few weeks 3 times, and how those 3 small decisions quietly rewired her entire life. The call came in on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, unremarkable Tuesday that gives no hint it's about to change anything. She was still drinking her first cup of coffee when her phone buzzed, a contact saved simply as Wildlife Center. She'd volunteered with them off and on for a few years, helped transport animals, sat with injured birds, nothing too complicated, nothing that followed her home. But that Tuesday was different, and the voice on the other end of the line was careful in the way people are when they're about to ask a big favor disguised as a small one. A bobcat kitten had been found near a highway construction site about 40 miles east of town. Construction crews had cleared a stretch of scrubland, and somewhere in the process, a litter had been scattered. Only one kitten was recovered. The rehabilitation center was full, beyond full, really, and they needed someone to foster just temporarily. A few weeks, maybe less. She had the space, she had the patience, and she had, perhaps more than she realized at the time, exactly the kind of quiet life that a frightened, half-starved wild kitten needed to feel safe in. She said yes before she fully thought it through. The kitten arrived wrapped in a towel, barely larger than her 2 fists pressed together. Its eyes were open but dull, its spotted fur matted at the edges. It didn't hiss, didn't struggle. It just looked up at her with the particular exhaustion of something that had already been through more than it understood. She set up a spare room, lined a crate with soft fleece, and placed a heating pad beneath a folded towel the way the center had instructed. She fed it every few hours through the night using a small syringe. By the 3rd day it was eating on its own. By the end of the 1st week it was strong enough to bat the syringe out of her hand. She laughed for the first time in a while that morning. Weeks passed. The kitten, she never gave it a name right away. A small act of self-protection she later recognized for exactly what it was, grew steadily. Its legs lengthened. Its paws, always slightly too large for its body, began to make sense. It learned the geography of the spare room, and then when she cautiously left the door open one afternoon, the geography of the hallway. It sat at the end of the corridor and stared at her with an expression that was not quite affection and not quite calculation, but something alive and curious in between. She understood, somewhere around week 6, that it wasn't going back. The rehabilitation center confirmed what she already knew. The kitten had imprinted too strongly on human presence for a safe release. Returning it to the wild would almost certainly mean its death. There were long-term sanctuary options, but they were far away, crowded and uncertain. She had a yard, she had time, she had a spare room that was already, undeniably, someone else's home. She signed the fostering paperwork that made things permanent, and tried not to think too hard about what she'd just agreed to. That might have been the whole story, if life had cooperated. About 8 months later, the Wildlife Center called again. Another bobcat kitten, a female this time, found near a logging road in the hills to the north, her mother gone in a way no one could fully explain. Feisty, the center coordinator said. A real handful. The woman hesitated longer this time. She stood in her kitchen and looked down the hallway toward the room where the first bobcat was currently. She knew dismantling something. She thought about the furniture she'd already replaced. The curtain rod that had come down twice. She said yes anyway. The moment the carrier entered the front door, everything changed. The first bobcat came around the corner and stopped. The kitten inside the carrier pressed herself against the metal grate and puffed to twice her actual size. For a long suspended moment, neither animal moved. Then the first bobcat made a sound, not a hiss, not a growl, something lower and more uncertain than either, and retreated down the hallway. The woman stood in the entryway holding the carrier, already slightly regretting her decision. By nightfall they were chasing each other through the kitchen. The house was never quiet again after that. Curtains became climbing walls. The back of the couch became a racing track. Meals were prepared with one eye always watching the counter behind her. She started moving breakable things to higher shelves, and then realized there were no shelves high enough. She laughed more. She also knocked things over more, reaching around small spotted bodies that had arranged themselves in doorways and on stair landings, as if specifically chosen to be underfoot. She told herself twice that she was done, that 2 was enough, that this was already unusual enough for one lifetime. And then about a year after that there was a wildfire. The rescue call came on a hot August evening. A male bobcat, larger than either of hers, pulled out of the burn zone, disoriented and singed at the edges but alive. Every facility was overwhelmed with fire season rescues. The center coordinator's voice was tired in a way that made asking feel like a last resort. She looked around her house, at the scratched baseboards, at the replaced furniture, at the two spotted shapes currently involved in what appeared to be an extremely serious disagreement about a dish towel. She said yes for the third time, and somewhere in that moment, though she couldn't have named it then, something shifted. This wasn't fostering anymore. This wasn't temporary. This was just her life now. Strange and loud and utterly unpredictable, and it was only just beginning. Nobody warns you about the socks. She'd read everything she could find about bobcats in captivity. Their dietary needs, their territorial instincts, their sensitivity to routine. She'd consulted with the Wildlife Center. She'd watched hours of footage. None of it mentioned the socks. Specifically, the way one particular bobcat had developed a quiet, dedicated obsession with stealing them directly out of the laundry basket and distributing them across the house like some kind of spotted, judgment-free interior decorator. That was just mornings. Before the alarm ever sounded, all three were already moving. One launched onto the bed with the grace and subtlety of a small boulder. Another had discovered that the dresser top was an excellent place to sit and push objects, deliberately, thoughtfully, one at a time onto the floor below. The third patrolled the hallway with the focused energy of an animal who had decided that 5 in the morning was in fact the correct time to begin the day. She stopped fighting the schedule. She woke up early now. The living room had become their arena. Most evenings the two younger bobcats began a wrestling match that started as gentle play and escalated quickly into something that looked to any outside observer like a full athletic event. They moved fast, faster than most people expected from animals that large, flipping and rolling and pinning each other against the base of the couch while she stood nearby, phone raised, trying to capture it before it was over. She rarely succeeded. They were always 3 moves ahead of the camera. The third bobcat, the large male from the fire zone, rarely joined the chaos directly. He preferred to watch from elevated positions, the back of the armchair, the top of the cat tree she'd built reinforced with 2x4s after the first one collapsed. He observed everything with an expression of deep, unhurried patience that she found both calming and slightly unnerving. Each of them had become undeniably their own person. One was mischief in a spotted coat, a problem solver, a drawer opener, a boundary tester who seemed genuinely delighted every time she reacted. One was quiet and watchful, content to sit at a distance and simply exist near her, which turned out to be its own kind of companionship. And one followed her from room to room with the steady, unhurried loyalty of something that had chosen her completely. Together they were relentless, exhausting, often ridiculous, and every single evening when the house finally went still and all 3 had settled into their various corners and armchairs and chosen patches of floor, she sat in the quiet and felt something she hadn't expected when any of this began, completely unexpectedly at home. There was a moment she remembered it clearly, when she walked into the kitchen to find the largest bobcat standing on the counter, calmly eating directly from a pot she'd left cooling on the stove. He wasn't startled. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at her with an expression of complete, untroubled confidence, as if the counter had always been his and the pot had always been dinner. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she moved the pot. That was the thing nobody fully understood from the outside. The part that didn't make it into the funny moments in the phone videos. These were not domesticated animals. They had never been and would never be house cats in any recognizable sense. They were wild in the truest way, not dangerous exactly, but governed entirely by instinct and curiosity and a complete indifference to the concept of personal property. They were strong in ways that surprised her regularly. A playful swat that was meant for nothing could clear a coffee table in one motion. A door left unlatched was an open invitation. A bag left on the floor was already someone else's. She had to change the house to fit the life she was actually living. Furniture was replaced with sturdier pieces, solid wood, nothing hollow, nothing with legs that couldn't bear weight from above. Shelving was anchored directly into studs. Cabinet latches went on every low door after the smaller female figured out, in the space of one afternoon, that pulling the handle sideways worked just as well as pulling it forward. The scratching posts she'd bought in the beginning were laughably small now. She'd long since replaced them with floor-to-ceiling climbing structures she'd built herself, reinforced and bolted, running along 2 walls of the back room. The house looked nothing like it had before, and still, there were hard days. Days when something got broken that couldn't be replaced. Days when the energy level in the house was simply beyond what one person could match. days when she questioned quietly whether she had done right by them, whether a life inside four walls, however large and enriched, was ever truly enough for an animal built to cover miles. She sat with those questions honestly. She spoke to wildlife professionals. She watched them closely, always for signs of stress or frustration. What she saw more often than not was this: 3 animals who were bonded to her, bonded to each other, and settled in a way that wild-born animals rarely are when something has gone wrong in their care. They weren't suffering. They were in their own strange and spotted and entirely chaotic way, exactly where they belonged. Years have a way of softening things. The kittens she had carried in towels and fed through the night were large now, broad-shouldered, thick-pawed, unhurried in the way that only animals who feel genuinely safe ever become. The wrestling matches still happened, but slower, more theatrical than urgent, like 2 siblings who had already established the hierarchy years ago and were simply going through the motions out of tradition. The sock thief still operated, but with less urgency. The counter-climber still climbed, but paused now to look back at her first, checking, in his quiet way, whether she was nearby. She always was. Visitors who came to the house for the first time went through a predictable sequence. First, disbelief, the polite, careful kind, where they smiled and nodded and clearly assumed she was exaggerating. Then one of the 3 would round a corner, or drop from a shelf, or simply materialize in a doorway the way large cats do, and the disbelief became something else entirely. Wide eyes, a hand reaching instinctively for someone else's arm, a laugh that came out slightly higher than intended. 3 bobcats, inside a house, looking back at them with complete, unbothered calm. She had stopped trying to explain it, and started simply letting people experience it. There was nothing she could say that would prepare them. There was nothing that had prepared her either. What she had learned, slowly, across years of early mornings, and rearranged furniture, and questions she sat with honestly in the quiet, was something she hadn't expected when the first call came in on that gray Tuesday morning. She had expected to help. She had expected effort, inconvenience, temporary disruption. She had not expected to be changed by it, but she had been. These animals had asked nothing of her except consistency, patience, presence. They didn't need her to be extraordinary. They needed her to show up the same way, every day, until showing up became the whole point. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the chaos, the laughter, the hard days, the ridiculous ones, she had learned to do exactly that. The house was quieter in the evenings now. All 3 settled earlier than they used to. She moved through her home carefully, the way people do when they've learned to share space with something they deeply respect. She had rescued 3 bobcats. That part was true, but she understood now, in the particular way that only years can teach, that the exchange had never really been one-sided. They had given back steadily and without ceremony, exactly as much as she had.